Hello, I'm Ipo Swords, and these are my top 5 favourite antique swords that I have in my collection. Let's start off with number 5. This is a French model of 1882 Infantry Officers sword. However, this is one of the extremely fancy presentation grade swords made according to the model of 1882. This particular example is inscribed with the date 17th of July 1896, and it has an elaborately frost-etched blade on both sides. It also has an elaborately decorated guard, featuring a vine leaf motif across the entire guard. The backstrap, likewise, is also very elaborately decorated. It features the initials of the person who initially owned it, being SC or CS. This example is exceptionally fine and is comparable to pieces in museums such as the Australian War Memorial, another place which hosts an elaborately decorated 1882. I actually own something like 6 Model 1882 or derivatives of that model, including predecessors from the African colonies. It is one of my favourite patterns of sword of all time, and this is one of my favourite examples in my collection or any other. It is both a stout and long-bladed sword, clearly made to be able to handle the rigours of battle, but made for someone who would prefer to be seen rather than engage in battle. It is exceptionally finely made, being made of German silver, an alloy which does not actually contain silver, but nonetheless looks very similar. And that is number 5. Number 4 on my list is a rather more exotic sword, if you will. This is a Turkish Yataghan, a forward-curving infantry sword made for a Zeybek chief. Zeybeks refer to an Anatolian form of militia, and Efe, or chief, is a sort of person who would have owned this particular example. The blade is made of bars of twisted steel known as a Turkish Ribbon Twist, and is inlaid on one side with the names of the 7 sleepers, a Quranic legend based off the cave of Ephesus in the region of Western Anatolia, and on the other side it is signed that it was made by Hussein. The hilt on this is likely made of ram's horn, which has been reshaped in heat in order to have a characteristic T-shaped pommel, which is how you know that this sword was made for a Zeybek. The blade and hilt, however, are of a much higher manufacturing quality than what you normally see on Zeybek militiamen swords, which tells us that it was probably for an Efe or chief. It is also of the form that you'd see all across Ottoman Turkey at the time, somewhere in the early half of the 18th century. It is therefore unclear whether this has been rehilted for a Zeybek Efe, or whether it is simply a very generic blade style with inscriptions that match the region. It is an exceptionally well-made martial sword, being incredibly stiff due to a T-shaped spine. The relatively broad and very acutely edged blade is still extremely sharp to this day. You could shave hair with this. This sword is one of the best handling swords in my collection, despite being a relatively stout blade and balancing relatively far into the blade. The light overall weight and manageable length of this sword mean it would be an exceptionally good infantry sword, especially if you're on something like a boat or spending a lot of time using a shield. Overall, this Turkish Yataghan is my 4th favourite blade in my collection. My number 3 favourite sword in my collection also hails from Ottoman Turkey, but is slightly later. This is an Ottoman Pala, a type of kilij, or rather sword in Turkish, intended for use by both infantry and cavalry depending on the length of the sword. This particular example is on the shorter side, and was therefore intended for an infantryman to use. This particular Pala is also made of Turkish Ribbon Twist. However, in this case, it's made entirely of twisted bars of steel, the entire width of the blade, making it an incredibly attractive and valuable blade to have. The hilt on this is made of horn, and the crossguard is made of a copper alloy, most likely some form of bronze. Much like the earlier Yataghan I showed, this blade from around 1780 is both short and overall very light and features a T-shaped spine. This once again makes it an incredibly maneuverable sword, which is also, again, relatively light and incredibly stiff owing to this T-shaped spine. The distal portion of the blade has no such T-spine and is incredibly thin, meaning that the blade geometry in this part of the blade is ideal for slashing cuts and chops into people wearing textile clothing and padded armors, which it would have encountered fairly often. It does, however, mean that this blade is very poor at thrusting, as this portion is extremely flexible and can only get through very soft targets, for example someone wearing civilian clothing. This Ottoman Pala from between 1780 and around 1810 is one of the finest examples of pattern welding from its region. It may not be an elaborately decorated sword as it features no ornamentation in the form of metal inlay. However, the steel itself is of exceptionally high quality and still has a good ringing hard temper to this day. My number 2 top sword is a return to Europe. This is a European Kaliesha Small sword, although it is a very atypical example of such. A normal Kaliesha Mod Small sword will narrow down in the last 2/3 of the blade, being only broad near the hilt. This example, however, is broad for the entire length, for reasons which no one can entirely explain, as it is truly one of a kind. It features an elaborately pierced hilt, which is original to the blade, as well as a significantly more crude knuckle bow and grip, which are probably not original to the blade and are 19th century replacements, indicated by the facetted style of this cut steel grip. The pommel, however, is original to the guard and features the same floral motif, a sort of vine leaf style. The blade on this is a classic hollow ground triangular section, as you would see on any small sword. However, it is much, much broader, being broad to an almost extreme extent. As a result, it has sharp cutting edges, which are more than capable of producing draw and push cuts if they come in contact with your skin. It is also incredibly stiff despite its light weight. This sword is so stiff that I cannot bend it without exerting extreme pressure on it, which I'm not going to do because it's from around 1720 to 1740, according to the blade and hilt components that are original to the blade. This sword is relatively short and relatively light. However, it is exceptionally agile, exceptionally stiff, and has the ability to both cut and thrust. This would therefore make a pretty exceptional dueling sword, despite its overall shorter length. And while this sword is relatively short, I would love to have a full-length reproduction to use in my own testing. The blade on this sword is exceptionally unique. However, other very broad small swords do exist, though most of them are more tapered than this. An example can actually be seen in the Mount Vernon collection, owned by George Washington, of one of these extremely broad small swords, although even that is more tapered than my example. And that sums up number 2, an unusual Kaliesha small sword. And finally, we come to my favourite sword in my collection. It will come as no surprise to my regular viewers to see this regular guest on the channel. This is a Persian Shamshir or cavalry sword from around 1590 to 1601. It is signed Assad Allah al-Isfahani, one of the most famous blacksmiths in the entirety of Persian history. It's made of Pulad Kara Khorasan, or black steel from the Khorasan region. Pulad is a form of crucible steel, naturally forming patterns due to key impurities in its composition. This blade is a dedicated cavalry saber, being both relatively long, relatively hefty, and balancing far from the guard. It is, nonetheless, an incredibly well-made sword, and even in an infantry context, the way I handle it feels very well balanced, if a little on the heavy side. It features a steel pommel, a horn grip, and a steel crossguard, as well as the gold-inlaid Kara Khorasan blade as mentioned earlier. The story on this sword supposedly says that it was imported by Sefer Muratovich, an Armenian merchant around the year 1601, who went on a mercantile mission according to the behest of Polish King Zygmunt III Vaza, or Sigmund III Vaza. This sword is made of watered steel, which is more commonly known as true Damascus steel. It is made with no folding in its processing. It simply has patterns due to key impurities in the steel. One day, I would love to have a chemical analysis done on this blade using atomic emission spectroscopy. However, that's currently outside of my budget for reasons you can most likely understand. This sword is therefore one of my oldest, by far my rarest, and, truth be told, my favourite sword in my collection. This has been iPo Swords. I hope you've enjoyed the video because that's all I've got for you today. Until next time, stay sharp.